welcome everyone. Welcome to another edition of Remixing Politics and Culture with me, your host, Pam. I am a public relations and marketing professional with a passion for social justice, voter advocacy, and culture. And tonight we're going to have a very interesting conversation. We are going to discuss the intersection of media, race, and the Black freedom struggle with a very special guest, Professor Jerry Gershenhorn. I'm going to bring him up so you guys can. Okay, there you go. So, as I talked to you about him, he recently retired from North Carolina Central University, also known as NCCU, where he was the Julius L. Chambers Professor of History. He specializes in 20th century United States history, African American history, North Carolina history, and media history. He taught at he taught at NCCU for 29 years. Professor Gershenhorn earned graduate degrees in history, an MA from North Carolina Central, and a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has published two books. The first, entitled Melville J. Herskovitz and the Racial Politics of Knowledge. His second book, entitled Lewis Austin and the Carolina Times, A Life in the Long Black Freedom Struggle, which won him a Reagan Old North State Award for nonfiction. Professor Gershenhorn has also published articles in the Journal of African American History, the North Carolina Historical Review, Journalism, History, and Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. He serves on the executive committee of the North Carolina Literary and Historical Association. Welcome, 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 Professor Gershenhorn, to the show.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Yes, yes. And I hope people will start coming into the onto the stream. But in the meantime, I am going to, for whoever is listening to me right now, no matter what platform you're on, whether it's LinkedIn, Facebook, or YouTube, could you please put a one in the chat? Please. Please put a one in the chat so I can see if you're able to participate with us. We had a little glitch with that last time. If you are on YouTube and don't have a YouTube account, I have included the StreamYard link that you can use to chat with us. Okay, I don't see anything so far, but okay, there's a one. Thank you, Samaj Brown. Thank you. Okay, so I know things are working over there on Facebook. But anyways, let's get going into the questions. I am so fascinated about what your line of research and whatnot. So let's just jump right into it. Talk to us a little bit, Professor, about the origins of the Black press during the 19th century and its role in the lives of African American people at that time.
Yeah, so the first Black newspaper was founded in 1827 in New York City by John Russwurm and Samuel Cornish. And the goal of Black newspapers in the pre-Civil War era was essentially to fight for anti-slavery, to fight for the freedom of African Americans during the era where most African Americans lived in the South and were enslaved. And so there are many newspapers. People are probably most familiar with Frederick Douglass,
yes,
who had a few newspapers, but probably the most famous was the North Star.
Yes.
And so many, and a lot of people, sometimes people know about some of these major figures in American and African American history, but they don't always recognize them, that one of their major pathways to fight for the rights of African Americans was through the press, through the media, and in the 19th century, that meant largely newspapers. So
Mm-hmm.
people like Frederick Douglass, and then later on in the 19th century, Ida B. Wells, who I think is well known,
Yes.
but people don't necessarily always focus on her as a journalist. And going back to then after the Civil War, after the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865 and the abolition of slavery in the United States, the goal of the black press in the late 19th century was to fight for truly equal citizenship and all that entailed: voting rights, economic justice, justice in the courts. Um, uh, and that justice in the courts meant justice throughout the legal system. So against, unfortunately, some of the same things that we're dealing with today, fighting against police brutality, fighting against voter suppression. Maybe it's a little bit different in some ways, but of course, after the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which was supposed to guarantee African Americans citizenship and voting rights, by the end of Reconstruction by the 1880s and 1890s, in the early 1900s, the southern states were passing laws to suppress the black vote. I'm sure many people are aware of the poll tax, the literacy test,
Oh,
and the
yeah.
grandfather clause. And
Mm-hmm.
although we don't have those methods of suppressing the black vote, we are, of course, many people are aware that there are newer methods that are being used today. And
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so frustrating. Today we just had a my church and a synagogue and a Lutheran church and the Divine Nine and some of everybody got together and did souls to the polls. And in some states, we know that that's been done away with, or they're trying to do away with it, and that type of thing. So it I remember sitting next to a lady today at church, and the speaker was talking about all the means of suppression. It was Mark Morial, the CEO of the National Urban League. He was our guest speaker, and I looked at this lady to my right, and I was like, "We keep going over the same old stuff, the same crap over and over and over again." But anyway, I digress. I digress.
no, but you're right. I mean, it's you know, hit, you know, I guess it goes back to well-known statement Frederick Douglass made a long time ago when he
Hmm.
said, "Power conceives nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will."
Right.
There are times when freedom and justice is on the upswing,
Hmm.
but those who feel threatened, those who feel their power threatened, reemerge, and in new ways they try to reaffirm their power. And of course, in American history, it's often been about race, and black people or other minorities fighting for justice, and then white supremacy reemerging, or not reemerging. It's always been there, but reemerging, I guess, in different ways and sometimes more powerful.
Hmm.
And so the media, in many ways, unfortunately, facing some of the same issues just in different forms.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, so Professor, what and you all know what the rules are. Please feel free to ask questions and get involved in the chat, and maybe even some of you might want to come up stage. I have a link for you to do that. Just participate, please. So, Professor, what role did the white press play in perpetuating white supremacy and Jim Crow in the 19th and 20th centuries?
Yeah, and I think this is an area I think that has been up until recently less focused on, at least
Mm-hmm.
by historians. So in writing about the black press, I mean, the black press was founded, as I mentioned, to fight for racial justice, but also to be a voice
Mm-hmm.
for African Americans, for the black community, and to be a place where African Americans could see uh, information, news about their communities. I mean, it wasn't always, you know, a direct fight for justice in a way. I mean, it was a voice. I mean, just like any newspaper, you would have you might have a page devoted to the church.
Mm-hmm.
So, people could read about the church, their churches. People could read, society, marriages and divorces, as well as, about politics and an editorial page and that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But these things, the white press either ignored the black community for most of American history,
Mm-hmm.
or they demonized the black community.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yes.
if there was reporting about the black community in the late 19th or early 20th century and to the mid 20th century, it was about, African Americans being accused or committing crimes,
Mm-hmm.
and that would be about it. And so the black press was a way for African Americans to read about their own communities and to have a place where their voice could be heard. But beyond that, the white press played maybe a more insidious role, because they were basically a basic support structure for white supremacy. I mean, when in just 1898, many people know about the, horrible massacre of African Americans in Wilmington, North Carolina. Well, Josephus Daniels, the
Mm-hmm.
publisher of the Raleigh News and Observer, was
Server.
one of the key leaders of the white supremacy campaign of that era. And
Mm-hmm.
that was about, violence against African Americans, but it was also about overthrowing what was then called the fusion movement, where African Americans were working with some poor and middling whites in the
Mm-hmm.
populist movement. And you had success from 1894 to 98. African Americans held a lot of political positions,
Mm-hmm.
and there was kind of an opportunity, a growth of democracy in North Carolina for a brief period. And the reaction of the white supremacists and many times the white elite, including Josephus Daniels, was to suppress the black vote,
Mm-hmm.
and to essentially quote unquote put African Americans back in their subordinate place.
Let me ask you something, Professor Gershenhorn. Getting back to the Wilmington riots, my understanding was, I'm not a native North Carolinian, but I've been living here a long time. I heard that history was literally locked up in the library in Wilmington somehow. And it wasn't until not too recently, I don't know what the year or whatever that this information started spilling out, but it certainly wasn't anything that was taught in the schools to the children about this major uprising, this major horrific massacre that happened in their town. And and Wilmington's not that big,
Right,
so.
right. Although Wilmington, it's not that big today, but up until about the Civil War, it was about the largest city in the state. So it was it was a very rural state, of course. So it wasn't that many people, like 10,000 people in Wilmington in say,
Uh-huh.
1865. But you're
Mm-hmm.
right. It was. I mean, there were historians who wrote about what was often called the race riot. You might better call it a massacre today. But
Mm-hmm.
Helen Edmonds, who was a professor at North Carolina Central University, wrote a book in the 1940s that was about the fusion movement in North Carolina that I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
But she the destruction of the fusion movement was tied up with the Wilmington massacre, and she wrote about that back in the 1940s. And then later on, there was a book called "We Have Taken a City" by an historian named Prather, who also wrote. This would have been, I think, maybe in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember a story by he's actually a novelist named Philip Gerard, who
Mm-hmm.
teaches at UNC Wilmington, or at least he did up until relatively recently. I'm not sure if he still does, but he was in the literature and English department, and he published a novelized version of what happened, which was very close to the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And when he at the Wilmington, I think it was the Wilmington Historical Museum or Historical Society, they would not let him speak. People would invite people about books, obviously quite relevant. And this was back, I would say, in the 90s, because we had him. We have a series at Historic Stagville, the Early Thorpe Lecture Series we do annually, and we had him to come, and I remember him talking about that. So in Wilmington, it was absolutely suppressed. I've had students at NCCU who were from Wilmington, and some of them didn't know about it.
Yeah, that's
until
what I
very
mean.
recently.
It was crazy that they
Right.
didn't even know about that basic history in their hometown, and they grew up there. How it just it blows my mind. Absolutely blows my mind. But I was told that it was locked under lock and key in the library, and I guess some great librarians held on to it. I don't know. I don't know. We have somebody in the chat that made a comment. Let's see. We still are not free because we have to have our voting rights renewed after so many years. Why? From
Yeah.
Freddie and Butler. Yeah, it well, and look, we still haven't. I don't even know what happened to the John Lewis voting rights bill. I, you know, I
Well,
I know.
we can't get it passed until the Senate, the Senate filibuster. I think
Yeah.
it passed in the House because you don't have
Oh,
a filibuster, but you got to get those 60 votes, and Democrats only having 50 plus the vice president.
mm-hmm,
So, in the old days, I mean, going back to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it
mm-hmm,
was renewed a number of times over the years, and the
right.
Republicans back in the 70s and 80s
Mm-hmm,
supported it. But
mm-hmm,
I would say since the Reagan era, and you've
mm-hmm.
had this kind of, and then George W. Bush, and now in the Trump era, the Republicans have become, I guess, not hiding their their racist tendencies, and now they're just all about suppressing the black vote if they can, and other minorities as well, in order to win by any way they can.
Right, right. And the thing is that all of the dirty, ugly parts of racism used to be in silence, and now it's not so much anymore. Since Trump came on board, it's like anything goes. Almost. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely come out more, publicly.
Mm-hmm.
And they used to say, when Ronald Reagan was running, they would, they'd be kind of illusions. It would be somewhat subtle. Everyone knew what was going on.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember I think it was George H.W. Bush when he ran for president. He had the Willie Horton
Yes.
ad, which was an ad showing an African American and saying that, well, they're kind of saying the same thing, that crime is the fault of the Democrats.
Right. Right. And that's what they're doing to Sherry Beasley. These horrific ads. And I spoke with her today. She was at our church for the Souls to the Polls event, and I just told her I was going to do everything I could to dispel that crap that they were saying, because she just thanked me and she says we just have got to do it, because really and truly that was the message today, is that democracy is literally and figuratively on the line, period. It
Right.
just is.
And when you talk about the media and the parallels between, say the early 20th century or the Jim Crow era and today, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it's about getting the truth out.
Right.
The white press did not print the truth about the black community, or they ignored them, as I said, and
Mm-hmm.
that they were backing up, white supremacy. And today you got many media outlets basically doing the same thing. So
Mm-hmm.
if you watch, which maybe you and many of our listeners don't, but
Mm-hmm.
if you hear about what's going on Fox News or Newsmax, or that Parler that is supposed to be an alternative to Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and that they talk about crime being a problem in states run by Democrats or in urban areas, and how
Right.
urban is used as a subtle thing for
Black.
for blacks and minorities, black and brown people.
Yeah.
But the reality is that crime rates, homicide rates, are higher in rural states, in Republican states.
That's right. And that
Mississippi
is,
and Louisiana are, you know, yeah,
yeah, absolutely. And the other thing too, let's look at all of these crime statistics, and we can point to the proliferation of guns and really relax gun laws in places like Texas. I mean, it's just like it come as you are with your gun, I mean, just ridiculousness. And so you're wondering, you're going to talk about a proliferation of of crime, you got to look at what are your laws saying and doing, you know.
Right. And then
Yeah.
those cities that are many cities run by Democrats, with Democratic mayors, which have pretty good gun laws. But then if the next state over, they have a very loose gun law. They have no restrictions.
Mhm.
Obviously people travel. They come from, people. The Republicans blame Chicago, but
Mhm.
it's easy for someone coming from Indiana with a gun and go to
Right.
Chicago because
Right.
Indiana is a Republican governed state, and their gun laws would be less restrictive.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's can you tell us any more things about how the white press, I was just thinking how they definitely perpetrated white supremacy and whatnot was in the Tuskegee, not Tuskegee, the Tulsa,
Oh,
Oklahoma
Tulsa.
massacre.
Oh, yeah.
About the guy allegedly bumped into the lady or maybe wanted to rape the girl. Some foolishness.
Right. And it
What?
was the white press in Wilmington, who spread the lies about Alex Manley and the black press. But in
Mhm,
Tulsa, in researching the black press, I knew about Tulsa, of course, and the murder of hundreds by white mobs in
mhm,
1921. But there was a black newspaper there, run
mhm,
by a guy named Andrew Smitherman,
mhm,
the Tulsa Star.
mhm,
And he had done some of the types of things in terms of trying to shine a light on lynching and that type of thing, and in in Tulsa, in Oklahoma.
mhm,
And one of the commonalities, I guess, in Wilmington is that these white mobs, these white supremacists, they targeted the black press. They did, just like they destroyed, the offices and the building of the Wilmington paper run by Alex Manley, the black newspaper. The same thing happened to Smitherman. His paper was destroyed as well.
mhm.
That
Yes,
was,
it was.
and he had to flee. He had to flee the state. Unfortunately, he was helped by another black journalist, Roscoe Dunjee of the Oklahoma City Black Dispatch, who was a contemporary and very
Mhm,
outspoken advocate of African Americans' rights.
mhm,
But it was the white press that was, fomenting this demonization of the black community.
mhm,
So when there was these, violent outbursts, or I would say substantial outbursts, mob attacks where hundreds were killed. These were, the stage was set by the white press demonizing African Americans in their newspapers prior to that.
mhm,
So white people believed that, these things about African Americans, and they never read anything about, African Americans getting married or African
mhm,
Americans, graduating from high school or college.
mhm.
These types of, things were not reported in the white press. So
Right,
white had a very one-sided, view of the black community, which
right, right.
helped to perpetuate, this type of white supremacy and violence toward the black community.
Something I noticed today in our worship service that we had worship service here in Durham with the Judea Reform congregation. We had members of St. Paul Lutheran Church congregation and some other uh, folks, a number of politicians and what have you. And what was so profound to me is that Mark Moriel said that we all had come together in a sense of urgency. This was we were like we were dialing 911, and things are hot, and we're in trouble. We're in real trouble. And then we came together, and I thought to myself, how awesome it would be, how comfortable it was, and how awesome would it be had we been coming together a little bit more all along. you
Mm-hmm.
know and maybe this is a start of that, because I'm determined to go to their congregation, because I just love their rabbi, and doing press for he and my pastor, you just learn so much from one another, that it's unfortunate that we have some of these issues. Okay, So I'm going to ask you another question, Professor. Um, what were what were some of the obstacles that the Black press faced in giving a voice to its people?
Yeah,
Uh, I mean, we have the Constitution says we have a freedom of speech, but what did they face? What happened during that
right.
time?
I mean, you talk about the freedom of the press, which unfortunately has not always been enforced, especially with regard to the black press. I mean, think of what happened to Alex Manley in 1898, and of course Ida B. Wells she had to flee Memphis
Mm-hmm.
after her friends who opened up a grocery store in competition with a white grocery store, and they were lynched by a white mob. And she bravely spoke out and wrote against lynching and against white violence, and she eventually had to leave and move to Chicago. But she continued to work for the
Right.
black press. But there were all, kind of so many obstacles. But one, if you think financially, so black businesses had a difficult time. Black businesses has been one of the strategies for African American uplift, for you know for centuries. But because African Americans, first of all, generally could not get loans from white banks, white owned banks, and most of the banks were owned by whites in the 19th century or for a good part of the 20th century. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Another factor was most newspapers survive, survived largely based on advertising. So they have the advertising and subscriptions. The
Mm-hmm.
white daily press made most of their money off of advertising. The
Right.
black press, up until, for most of its history, got most of its money from subscriptions.
Mm-hmm.
That limited, their ability to, hire people, to hire reporters, and in many cases to survive. Many newspapers, black newspapers, didn't survive very long. The first paper, the Freedom's Journal I mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
survived only 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
Uh, and so that was an issue and then if you have outspoken African American journalists who are
Mm-hmm.
writing about the corruption and racism of the white community,
Mm-hmm.
well, white businesses are not, they're going to withdraw their advertising. And that happened. And so it was very difficult for black newspapers to survive financially. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but despite that, many did, and many were mostly, when you start up a business, whatever it is, and especially a communication business, some black journalists were, their goal was not the business; it was freedom. So
Mm-hmm.
Lewis Austin, who I wrote about in my book, who was the
Mm-hmm.
editor of the Carolina Times from 1927 to 1971, his business was always in trouble. And you know, the white officials were hoping it would go out of business. And of course, he survived the Great Depression. He survived. I mean, after his death, actually, his daughter ran the paper, Vivian Edmonds,
Right.
and in 1979, uh, arsonists put fire and burned down the building.
Mm-hmm.
Carolina Times existed at that time, but they didn't miss an issue. They had support from the community, um, and they were able to continue. So that was a difficulty. And then there were just out and out efforts to suppress the newspapers. An example is John McCrae, who was the editor of the Columbia, South Carolina Lighthouse and Informer.
Mm-hmm.
McCrae was a contemporary of Lewis Austin. He was the editor of the paper in the 1940s and 50s, and he was very outspoken about voting rights for African Americans, about integration of public schools before the Brown versus Board of Education decision,
Mm-hmm.
1954, about equalizing teacher salaries. African American teachers were paid quite a bit less than white public school teachers, during the period of segregated schools. And so one of the things that the white officials would try to do, and the courts and the police, they'd file libel suits against black journalists to try to put them in jail or financially out of business.
Really?
So McCrae was charged with libel because there was a African American man who was accused of raping a white woman, and he was charged. So McCrae interviewed, actually, he and a white journalist interviewed uh, the defendant, this African American defendant, and printed his defense.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, not the white journalist, I think it was a magazine, that guy was not charged. But
Uh-huh.
he was charged because they wanted to get rid of his newspaper. And the governor, James Burns of South Carolina, there's a lot of evidence that he was behind this.
I'm
So
sure.
they charged McCrae. It was about, I think it was 1950,
Mm-hmm.
and he was convicted. He got a suspended sentence, but he was told he couldn't leave the state. And then, he at one point he was in contact, I think, with the court, and they said he could leave to go to something. And once he left, when he got back, they arrested him and they
Mm-hmm.
put him in jail. He was in jail for several months, and during that period, it caused financial problems for the newspaper, and eventually they shut down. I think in great part because of the jailing of McCrae.
Of course.
So another case was a lot of people are probably familiar with Daisy Bates, who was very well known for the Little Rock,
Yeah.
Arkansas integration, the 9 black students who integrated Central High School in Little Rock in 1957, 3 years after the Brown decision.
Mm-hmm.
Well, she and her husband, Elsie Bates, they ran the Arkansas State Press, which was the black newspaper in Little Rock. And they had
Uh-huh.
done it for many years.
Mm-hmm.
And so even before the integration, they had been charged they were charged with contempt of court and this was a case about a strike.
Mm-hmm.
So they had printed information about these picketers
Mm-hmm.
who were in a picket line over a strike. These
Mm-hmm.
picketers had been charged uh, with, I think, assault or murder because someone was killed during the strike, even though they hadn't committed any violence at all.
Mm-hmm.
They hadn't done anything, but the court said that they were bystanders and they should have done something.
Oh
And
gosh. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of how DeSantis in Florida is having the police officers go up to these people and say, "You're under arrest. We have a warrant." And then the person says, "For what?" "For voting, something with voting." The police officers aren't even quite sure. He said, "I don't know, ma'am. We just got this warrant and we got to take you in." I mean, that's what, when you were telling that story, these stories about how these people randomly, these newspaper journalists randomly got picked up, got charges that were erroneous. It just gave me that flashback to what's happening in Florida.
right, where the officials are using the courts to
Mm-hmm.
suppress, present day, maybe the black vote. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and McCrae was behind voter registration in South Carolina at the
Mm-hmm.
time, and
Mm-hmm.
that, of course, removed. He stayed in journalism, but I think he actually left and went north, and still reported on South Carolina. But that newspaper by 1954 was gone, and the
Mm-hmm.
Arkansas State Press itself, it continued after the incident I talked about. But then after the Little Rock, integration of Central High School in Little Rock,
Mm-hmm.
this Arkansas State Press was driven out of business by harassment by the whites would harass African Americans who were delivering the paper or were selling the newspaper on newsstands. And
Mm-hmm.
also the white advertisers withdrew their advertising.
Mm-hmm.
And for a
Wow.
while, the NAACP actually subsidized the newspaper
Wow.
during the integration of Little Rock High School. But ultimately they couldn't continue. And by I think it was 1958 or 59, the Arkansas State Press was out of business.
Wow. We've got a question here. It says from Samaj Brown, was there a significant role of white allies during this time? I guess during the time that we just last spoke of, 19th and 20th century, was there a significant role of those allies?
Yeah,
What?
well, I guess I'm covering all, I'm jumping back and forth a little bit to the 19th and 20th centuries, and
Mhm.
there were always some white allies. But if I think of the story uh, of Lewis Austin, he would work. I mean, he once said, "I would work with anyone who was fighting for racial justice and equality for all and democracy." And he
Mhm.
did work with whites, and sometimes he worked with whites who were communists. because although one tactic to kind of demonize African American freedom fighters was to label them communists.
You're right.
It was actually the Communist Party, for example, in the 1930s, was one of the few or only white dominated organizations that actually supported African Americans' rights in the South. So sometimes there was this one guy, he sometimes used him as a reporter because an African American couldn't easily investigate, say, a lynching or violence against African Americans. So there were some allies, although for many, of course, during the modern civil rights movement of the 60s, there were certainly allies, but not too many of them were involved with the black press. Toward the end of Louis Austin's life, he had a white reporter who worked for the newspaper, and some people asked him, this was kind of the era of the Black Power movement, and so black nationalism was on the rise, and so some African Americans criticized him, like, you should give the job to an African American.
Right.
But he was of the integrationist era, and he wanted to see African Americans, being part and parcel of all of American society, and so he wanted to get to the situation where African Americans, of course, would be hired, and that was what was starting to happen during the late 60s and 70s. Some of the white papers started to hire African Americans, whereas prior to that, especially in the South, they hadn't at all.
Right.
So that was the case. But there were some white allies, but they were often, at least in the South, they were what I would say were more moderates. When people bandy around the term liberal or conservative or moderate, I remember when I was in grad school at UNC, I had a great professor named Jenna Ray McNeil, who's still teaching there. And I was writing a paper for her, and I was writing about James Shepard, the founder of North Carolina Central, and about the Hokut case, which was the first case to try to desegregate public higher education in the South. It was a case that Louis Austin was involved with. And so I was calling Louis Austin a radical and James Shepard a conservative.
Oh, really?
And she said, well, why is he a conservative? What do you call whites who supported what James Shepard was doing? Because James Shepard was opposing the integration of UNC because he wanted to see funding come to North Carolina College, as it was called then.
Right.
And he would prefer to see a graduate school added to North Carolina College as opposed to black students to go to UNC.
Yes.
But the whites, those who were called by many people white liberals, were taking the same position as Shepard. So how could a white man, like, say, Frank Porter Graham, who was head of UNC at the time, why is he a liberal who's advocating the same thing as James Shepard, and Shepard's a conservative?
Right.
In other words, you can't. So I would, in retrospect, I changed it. I called them both moderates because they were supporting better facilities for African Americans, but they were not willing to directly challenge segregation, which Louis Austin was.
Interesting.
John McCrae in South Carolina was. Some of these other black journalists were willing to do that.
Let me ask you this, Professor. What got you interested in this subject matter as a Caucasian man?
Yeah, well, I've always, for a long time, I guess I've been interested in, race and African American history because, my major at NCCU, my master's, and my PhD was, I guess, U.S. history. But I don't think you can understand U.S. history without understanding African American history and the history of race, Native Americans, and Latinos, and all. It's just, you can't. It's not a separate thing. I hate how sometimes you get a U.S. history book, and like in the early 19th century, so you have these different chapters about various topics, and then you get this one chapter on slavery, and that's like separate from the rest. Right, one chapter, right, exactly. But when Andrew Jackson was president, you had slavery. So you can't have a chapter on Andrew Jackson and they call it the Jacksonian era, or some people would even call it Jacksonian democracy, and it was anything but a democracy. But
Mhm.
you got to talk about slavery, because that was, that was a key aspect of American history. And
Right.
so I was interested in that. And then, of course, when I'd been out of school for a while, and when I came back to do my master's at NCCU, of course, I
Mhm.
was at a historically black college,
Mhm.
and a major focus of the courses is the black experience, whether it's in U.S. history or in Latin American history or in European history. I mean, we have scholars like Dr. Lydia Lindsay, Dr. Carlton Wilson. They're scholars of European history, but they've written some major works on blacks in Europe or blacks in England.
Mhm.
And so the African diaspora.
Mhm.
So I was kind of taught by people like that at
Mhm.
NCCU,
Mhm.
and I did my thesis on Early Thorpe, who was a historian at NCCU. And I first became interested in journalism because Early Thorpe, he taught at NCCU. He was an historian. He was uh, he when he was during World War II, he served overseas, and he was serving in Italy. And so when I was looking through his papers, one of the things I found was a letter he wrote to the editor of the Carolina Times in the 1940s.
To
And that
Miss Austin.
I didn't know anything about the Carolina Times then. I'm from New York, so I didn't
Right.
know much about North Carolina. You're talking about being from out of state,
Uh-huh.
so, until I got here about 33 years ago or so. And
Mhm.
so I read about that, and then the letter was very militant that Early Thorpe wrote, and he was very critical of James Shepard, because Shepard during World War II, he had to get funding from the state, the
Mhm.
state legislature.
Yeah,
All the state legislature, every member was white at the time,
of
and the
course.
governor. So he had to kind of, become friendly with them and get on their good side. So he would not be critical of them. And
Mhm.
sometimes he would say things that would ingratiate himself to them.
Mhm.
And people did, African Americans didn't like it. They thought he was being too conservative, or just not directly challenging
Mhm.
injustice in the way he should. So anyway, that's what Early Thorpe, of course, a young guy, he was probably 20 years old, wrote
Mhm.
this letter to the Carolina Times. And so then I started looking at the Carolina Times, which was on microfilm at the,
Yes.
and
I
later
used
on,
to for the world's largest microfilm company.
right. And now, of
Yes.
course, it's digitized. If anyone, out there wants to read the Carolina Times, from the going back to the 30s and 40s and etc., go to digitalnc.org, and you
Mhm.
can, not just the Carolina Times, but the Carolinian, which is
Mhm.
the Black News Weekly in Raleigh,
Mhm.
which has been around for decades and decades. Another important newspaper. I mean, that's a whole another interesting story. You have this family known as the Gervais, Jervay.
Know them very well. Being in PR, I deal with all of the newspapers and media, period. So I know Paul Gervais. His daughter has taken over now.
Right. Yeah, I
Mhm.
interviewed him a few years ago, and of
Mhm.
course, his father had the Carolinian, Paul Gervais Sr.,
Mhm.
and his father was kind of the founder of this kind of I don't know what you call it, it was sort of little empire in North Carolina,
Mhm.
because he was in Wilmington, and they actually started the Cape Fear Journal, now the Wilmington Journal, back
Right.
in I think it was the 1920s.
Mhm.
This was, I think, the first black newspaper in Wilmington since Alex Manly's Wilmington Daily Standard.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that took a lot of guts to start another black newspaper. And Thomas Gervais, who was a longtime editor in Wilmington, he was very outspoken in Wilmington. And Durham was tough too. But when you get to rural North Carolina and eastern North Carolina,
Uh-huh.
many civil rights activists compared eastern North Carolina to Mississippi in terms of how virulent the white supremacists were and how dangerous it was to speak out. So I think Lewis Austin was very brave, but I think Thomas Gervais as well, being
Yeah.
out in Wilmington.
And yeah, considering what happened in Wilmington. We have a question here. It's kind of going back to voting rights. Why do you have to pass any bills for us to have complete voting rights? Example, the John Lewis bill that's about voting rights.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You shouldn't. I mean, the 15th Amendment should satisfy it. The 15th Amendment says, it's unconstitutional to deny African Americans the right to vote. But uh, of course, we had the poll tax, grandfather clause, after
No.
that, and literacy test. And, since that time, of course, we had the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which
Right.
put federal restrictions on many of the southern states, which
Mm-hmm.
had discriminated against African Americans and had a big impact in the late 60s and on. But that piece of legislation has been basically torn apart by Supreme Court decisions, by
Mm-hmm.
this very conservative Supreme Court we have had
Yes.
over the last number of years. So that's one of the reasons. I mean, but it's a good question because you shouldn't have to have it. I mean,
Right.
there shouldn't be these types of restrictions on, oh, so we should get rid of mailboxes. I mean, some of it's ludicrous. I heard Marco Rubio, who's running for reelection in the Senate in Florida, he
Mm-hmm.
was saying you can't have mailboxes because what if you have somebody throws a bomb in a mailbox?
Oh, he just make, you know what? Val Demings showed him, cleaned his clock during the debate. That's all.
Right.
I hope that she wins. It's so scary how all of this stuff, the ignorance and the just sheer craziness, and then Marco Rubio and others of his race ethnicity. That's a whole nother topic, and I plan to deal with that because that whole thing about white Hispanic, and it's just mind blowing. I can't.
Yeah, I mean, if you read the history uh, of um, of Texas, for example,
Hmm.
and some of the other states, going back to even the early 20th century and uh, World War II era. So a lot of Latinos and
Hmm.
Mexican Americans, in particular, in Texas and some other areas, when they fought for their rights. Now, sometimes they fought in tandem with African Americans, but
Hmm.
many times they didn't, in part because they saw how African Americans were treated. And what they fought for was to be acknowledged as whites. They
Hmm.
wanted what some have called Caucasian rights or white rights.
Hmm.
How you may know about some of these books, like how the Irish became white, how the Jews became white. And you might think, well, that's crazy. They were white, but to be white in the United States early on was basically a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Those were the people who dominated. And in the 19th century, Irish people were discriminated against. Jews were discriminated against when they came here.
Hmm.
So in American history, to gain, kind of status, it was really white status. White privilege is what we call it today. But
Right.
but it's absolutely, and many Hispanics, I think, Latinos, and also many don't consider themselves uh, people of color, if you want to use that phrase,
Right. Yeah.
or what
Yeah.
their complexion is. In some cases, and
Hmm.
so it is a complex story. So when Democrats think, well, they're just going to get the Latino vote,
Hmm.
it's not. No, it's not that simple.
It's not
Let's-
that. It's very complex. Like I said, I want to deal with that topic. I had intended to the week before, but the person that I was going to have on to talk about it, she's also a DEI expert on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she happens to be both Hispanic and Native American.
A lot of Hispanics would be a Native American as well. I mean, of course, a lot of Americans don't always know, all of their heritage. I guess now
Right.
with this DNA testing and all, maybe people are finding out stuff they
Uh-huh.
didn't know. And then you have people who claim Native American heritage and don't have it. I just saw some historian gives historians a bad name that she was claiming it, and
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know why
Yeah.
people have to be. Why people just can't be authentic who they are.
I don't know.
You
I don't know. I don't know. Samaj Brown has another question. Question. She says, since race is a powerful wedge, it is a failed strategy to try and organize poor whites to align with poor blacks, given clear commonality due to class strata. That's a that's a that's something to think about, Professor.
Yeah, that's a big question in today and in American history. I mean, I
Mhm.
mentioned the fusion movement in 1894.
I've never heard of that movement
So
before.
it was a movement of basically farmers. That was, North Carolina, and it was actually throughout the South and the West. It spread into Kansas, Nebraska. It was in Texas, very big, North Carolina. And it succeeded for a while because of the kind of crux of the question, which is that sometimes in American history, poor whites and blacks have gotten together based on class. So at the time, farmers were having a very rough time. And of
Mhm.
course, if you're a black farmer or a white farmer, and banks are not giving you loans,
Mhm.
or the loans are at very high interest rates, both are going to suffer. And if
Mhm.
the railroads are going to charge very high rates to move your goods to market, they're both going to suffer.
Mhm.
So blacks and whites they didn't unite totally, because they had what they called formed organizations known as alliances. And you had in the South the Colored Farmers Alliance, and then the Southern Farmers Alliance, which was the white one. But
Mhm.
anyway, North Carolina, the fusion was basically blacks and whites, poor to middling blacks and whites, coming together based on class, common class, goals for
Mhm.
farmers to a large extent, and they succeeded.
Mhm.
But that didn't mean that those whites didn't still have uh, racist ideas about blacks. So
Mhm.
for a while, they kind of put that aside in order for common goals. And for a while, they did do some good things for poorer people. They capped interest rates. They made it easier to vote. And a lot of African Americans, as well as poorer whites, got elected. The union movement's another example, the labor union movement. Uh, for much of the union movement in the United States history, blacks were kept out of unions, which were dominated by whites.
Right.
During the Great Depression, the CIO was formed, and they
See,
had a,
what's CIO, Professor? What is
uh,
this?
well, initially it was the Committee on Industrial Organizations.
Uh
It was
huh.
part of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, a big federation of labor unions
Uh
that
huh.
dated back earlier, a few decades. But the CIO wanted the AFL was very racist generally. Didn't have African Americans, actually wouldn't have less skilled workers. And
Mhm.
the CIO's idea was to have one united working class, which would
Mhm.
make, if you're united, you're more powerful. You're more, if you want to fight against the capitalists, against the owners, you have to be united. And if
Mhm.
you have race to divide you or ethnicity to divide you, that's going to play into the hands of the industrialists. So the
Right.
CIO tried to get beyond that. The problem was that many of the white workers in the South didn't want to join with African Americans.
Mhm.
So it had some success, but it was kind of, I would say, mixed at best.
Uh huh.
But there were successes. In R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, you had a union formed in Winston-Salem,
Uh huh.
predominantly black workers, very successful during World War II and for a little bit after the war. And they kind of got better wages, conditions. They got recognition of the union, and then they ultimately tried to use that to mount a voter registration movement as well, based on the union and with NAACP support. And they elected an African American to the board of aldermen, which was like the city council in Winston-Salem, I think the first African American elected in the state during that
Mhm.
era in 1947.
Mhm.
So there have been some successes, but today you kind of see uh, that, like Stacey Abrams, she's
Mhm.
been very successful down in Georgia at, voter registration, particularly in African American communities.
Mhm.
I don't know that she necessarily focuses on, working class whites, because what the Republicans often do is just get their people out to vote. So
Mhm.
instead of trying to, dilute policies, some
Mhm.
Democrats argue that don't dilute your policies, but just get out your people to vote. Motivate your people by having policies that support, you know, African Americans, Latinos, working class people, middle
Mhm.
class people, etc. I mean, it's
Mhm.
too bad. I mean, it's also, it's once again about the media.
Yes.
You have to get the word out. It's not so easy when you have a lot of false information coming from a lot of media outlets.
Right,
And
right.
so if, when, how sometimes they do these polls and they say, are you supportive of Social Security? Yes. Are you supportive of Medicare? Yes. Are you supportive of increasing the minimum wage? Yes. Well, which party supports that? It's the Democrats, not the Republicans. Well,
No.
who are you
Yes.
voting for? Republican. It doesn't, so unfortunately, and a lot of times Republicans don't think. I mean, it's
Mhm.
become like a religion, I guess. You can't change someone's core beliefs.
Mhm.
The core
Mhm.
belief is they're Republican. People wouldn't. I don't know what your stance on vaccination and stuff like that and COVID, but some people they would see relatives dying of COVID and wouldn't get vaccinated.
Well, they're saying that now that the when the dust is settling, and they're saying where there has just been so many more Caucasian people who have died from it once the vaccine became available because of all of the false information
Right.
and and all of that foolishness for what? For what?
Right.
Just crazy. Listen, all of you guys that are listening, please hit the thumbs up button, particularly if you are on YouTube, and please consider subscribing. For all platforms that you're on, please hit the thumbs up button. It helps the algorithm. It does not cost you anything. Please hit the thumbs up button and like this video, please. And please consider subscribing. Okay, got this question for you, Professor. This last question. Well, it could be last if somebody else has something in the chat. Are there parallels between the history of the Black press in the 20th century and the current role of the media?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's sort of what we've been talking about, but I mean, the white press back in the 19th and 20th centuries, newspapers, stuff like that, they basically spread a false image of America. I mean, I was
Mm-hmm.
reading about, a case where, many people may know that a lot of black soldiers, after
Mm-hmm.
serving during the war, they came back to the United States, and some of them were killed. They were lynched or
Mm-hmm.
shot by whites. I mean, right here in Durham, North Carolina, Booker T. Spicely, a private in the Army who was stationed at Camp Butner, which is a few miles north of Durham. He
Mm-hmm.
was riding a bus and initially refused to go to the back of the bus. Uh,
Uh-huh.
then eventually he did. But as he got off the bus, there was a white bus driver who had a gun. And as he got off the bus driver got off the bus and shot him twice, killing him.
What?
The white newspapers reported on the bus driver was tried, which was unusual for a white man to be tried in those days for killing a black man.
Mm-hmm.
He was tried, but it was an all-white jury. But
Yes, so
the
you
but
got
the but the Herald Sun, the article that they published, said, "Oh, this is a great case where the courts and the laws did a great job, and the jury made their decision. You got to go by that." They didn't mention that the jury was all white.
of course they didn't.
I mean, that is obviously, people talk about objectivity or, you know, and that's the kind of thing they did. And so now if you look at Fox News or some of these others and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, there's this, the January 6th committee of the House, you won't see that on Fox News. They're not reporting it.
No, they
They're
aren't.
reporting is that those people are patriots who were
Right.
trying to overthrow the U.S. government.
Yeah. Well, they defiled our government, our houses that our tax dollars pay for. They literally defiled them and destroyed them. It was awful, awful, awful.
I mean, there's too many parallels, unfortunately.
Too many parallels.
I mean, one positive is, of course, the continued role. I mean, I focus on the black press, and a lot of people think the black press. I mean, obviously, there's many African American journalists who are
Hmm.
playing a huge role. A lot of people know Nicole Hannah-Jones, of course, and some of the stuff she's doing, and of course, the tremendous pushback she gets,
Yes.
which obviously shows you how important what she's doing. But there
Hmm.
are still if you check the National Newspaper Publishers Association, which is the association of black newspapers, there's
Mhm.
still well over 150 black newspapers. Most of them have websites. You can
Mhm.
go on the Carolinian's website. I mean,
Mhm.
unfortunately, the Carolina Times,
I
Kenneth
know.
Edmonds passed away.
They
Uh,
was my good friend.
yeah,
Actually, that was heartbreaking, just heartbreaking. I was so glad that our Durham History Museum had done that big spread, exhibit on the Carolina Times and his dad and
right.
that whole history. And then not too much longer, Ken succumbed. I think COVID eventually got him, I think.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
right at the beginning of COVID, and
Hmm.
yeah, it was so sad. He was.
It was very sad. And he has a son, but his son didn't have an interest in journalism, so that
Yeah,
was
there
that.
was some talk of by some local journalists, but obviously it's be a big undertaking to try
Mm,
to keep it going. But yeah, but I mean, there are the black press is still quite vibrant, and
mm-hmm,
but it's still, I'm sure you know better than me, being a current person dealing with the situation, what the struggles and the obstacles just to African Americans in the business of journalism and media.
mm-hmm. It's very interesting, and I think one of the things that journalists are having to learn is that when you in this day and age, you can no longer look at yourself as just a journalist, just a writer, just a uh, uh, thought leader or any of those things. You have to also know the business of the that business model, and that's the big issue. That's the big issue. Samaj had said a while ago that covenants were the norm to keep black men out of trades. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that was a big struggle. I mean, I remember reading an article about in Philadelphia where whites controlled the construction trades, and
Mm-hmm.
those were unions. So that was one of the problems with unions. Many of the unions are white controlled, and they
Mm-hmm.
just were trying to keep the jobs for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a huge struggle by black activists, various organizations to break through into those.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, right here in North Carolina, a huge struggle to break into the textile industry, which had been for decades strictly a job for whites. And then
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, once African Americans broke in, many of those companies went overseas.
They went
The
overseas.
jobs were lost for anyone.
What about our furniture making companies? Same thing, pretty
Same
much.
exact thing. The furniture industry was also all, only employed whites pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And that, yeah, that's mostly gone too, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very, very interesting. Professor Gershenhorn, I have really enjoyed our conversation. I really have. And Samaj says that it was an excellent conversation as well. Thank you, Samaj. Yeah, I thought that it was, you know, this is interesting, and it just shows you that the more things change, the more they stay the same.
It's
You know.
unfortunately, it's a long struggle. I mean, it was a long freedom struggle. People don't use that term for the civil rights struggle, but
Mhm.
struggle hasn't ended.
No, it hasn't. It hasn't.
There was a black newspaper down in Jackson, Mississippi, the Jackson Advocate,
Uh-huh.
in relatively recent years, when they
Mhm.
were publishing, I would say maybe in the 90s, they were publishing about police brutality and stuff like that, and they had people shooting at their offices. And
In the
that's
90s.
1990s. So, and we see what's happening all over today. You know, I mean, police brutality, and back in the days, it happened then, but a lot of times it's hard to know how many people, you know,
Yeah.
before they were recorded, you couldn't record anything.
Mhm.
The black press did their best to shine a light on the lynchings and the horrific violence.
Mhm.
They helped, they did have some successes. They helped to eventually, I think, get the white press to pay some attention.
Yes.
Eventually, the federal government did start to step in. It
Yes.
was a long haul to get that happening.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we are going to call it a night. I have appreciated you very much, and you'll have to have you back.
Well,
I
thank you.
saw Professor Irv Joyner today at church, and I told him I was having you on. Might be interesting to do an intersection with law and the media with what's going on here today. Have-
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. I appreciate it. Keep doing this good work.
All right. Thank you. And let's say goodbye to everybody. Let's wave to people goodbye. See you
Okay.
guys next time.